Started today. I think we have a number of really terrific speakers today and a lot to talk about. So welcome. We're really delighted that everyone was able to join us this afternoon. I'm Robin Mockenhult, the interim CEO for Virginia Funders Network. And for those of you who are new to Virginia Funders Network, it's a membership organization here in the Commonwealth that is about connecting and collaborating philanthropic organizations to make the best place in Virginia for all advancing opportunities for all who call Virginia home. So welcome. We're delighted to have you here today. This is our third annual post-General Assembly session. And so we're really excited to talking about what happened at the previous session the last month or so. We have some great speakers who are going to help us understand what did and in some cases didn't happen during the session, and especially talk about topics of interest for our members and for Virginia funders. So I just wanted to take a minute to remind everyone about the new format that we have for our educational sessions this year. We're going to have a number of speakers, as you're going to hear from in just the next few minutes. And then around 3 o'clock, we're going to break into small breakout groups. And it's an opportunity for everyone who's involved in the session today to join with peers and talk about areas of interest together that you work on. So whether it's health or workforce development or housing, et cetera, you'll have the opportunity to talk with others about those topics of interest. I want to, of course, put in a plug as Patty got us started this session for our annual conference coming up May 2nd and 3rd in Roanoke, Virginia, and we hope to see all of you there and perhaps some other members of your foundations and trustees that you hope to bring along. We have a wonderful program. Registration is open now and early bird registration ends at the end of this month. So we're hoping you all sign up and looking forward to seeing you there in Roanoke. So with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for today, Heather Peeler. Heather is the president and CEO of ACT for Alexandria. And perhaps more importantly for our conversation today, she is on the VFN advisory board. ACT has expanded its service to the community and its impact to Alexandria, and they have focused on issues related to racial equity, economic mobility for low-income Alexandrians, and youth success. Where I first met Heather years ago was when she previously was Vice President of Member and Partner Engagement at Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. And she's also served as Chief Strategy Officer for the Corporation for National and Community Service and also worked at Community Wealth Partners. Currently, Heather is serving as the chair of our sister organization, Washington Regional Area Grantmakers. And she's also a commissioner on the Washington, D.C. Commission on Out-of-School Time Grants and Youth Outcomes. So Heather, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Robin. I appreciate it, and want to extend my welcome to everybody who has made the time to join us for, I think, what's going to be a very interesting and engaging conversation. As Robin mentioned, we have two great panelists who will be lending their expertise and their perspectives to us this afternoon. And the topic du jour is the General Assembly. So we had another, I think, interesting General Assembly session in Richmond this year. And the two panelists that we have, I think, are going to help us make sense and make meaning of what happened or what did not happen, help us to understand what progress was made, and identify where we can be doing what we can be doing in the coming months, as still a lot of key decisions will need to be wrestled with by our representatives in Richmond. So please join me in welcoming Rachel Dean and Brian Koziel. Rachel is the CEO of Voices for Virginia's Children, the leading statewide child advocacy organization in Virginia. As the CEO at Voices for Virginia's Children, Rachel provides overall strategic and operational leadership of its mission to champion legislation legislation and public policies that achieve positive and equitable outcomes for young people. Rachel's career has been dedicated to legal and policy advocacy for racial equity, economic justice at the local, state, and national levels. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what's in the skinny budget that pertains to hopefully improving some of the outcomes and opportunities for young people in our state. And then we also have Brian Koziel. Brian is the executive director of the Virginia Housing Alliance, also the premier advocacy organization related to housing in the state. Brian has deep expertise in housing policy and has served as a researcher and a consultant to local governments across the country to help them advance equitable housing policy. And I'm guessing that housing is a pressing issue in almost every community that we each represent. So I'm very eager to hear Brian's take on the session. So we'll hear briefly from Rachel first and then Brian, and then we'll be followed by Q&A. So I encourage you to post questions in the chat along the way or jot them down. There'll be an opportunity for you to raise your hand when we get to the Q&A. And then, as Robin mentioned, we'll break into breakout groups so that we can just discuss and review some of the key things we heard, and then talk a little bit more specifically how Rachel and Brian's perspectives relate to some of the work that we're doing on the ground. So with that, let's jump right into things. Rachel, would you like to start us off?
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to be here. I'm Rachel Dean. I am the Chief Executive Officer at Voices for Virginia's Children, and I've been with Voices for just about 5 months. It's been a thrill to be at Voices. I actually worked with Brian many years ago. I was a houser before I turned to child advocacy. I spent many years at Legal Aid Justice Center and worked with Voices in that capacity. And so I'm going to start my presentation here. And thanks, Patty, for allowing me to share that. And that should. All right. Well, that's actually not the start of my presentation. Sorry about that. Okay. So I'm going to do a legislative update today on issues that have to do with child well-being in the General Assembly. And I think it is important to note that we don't have a finalized budget, and a lot of the legislative support for children in Virginia comes in the form of money for programs to help those children. So there's a lot still unknown. And I'll talk about the skinny budget a little bit. But first, a little bit about Voices. So Voices, as Heather shared, is the only multi-issue child advocacy organization in Virginia. We champion public policy and legislation to make equitable and positive improvements in the lives of young people. And when I say multi-issue, that's important for us because we don't live in a vacuum. It's not just about affordable childcare. It's not just about K-12 education. We operate at the intersection of all of those issues. And we know that advancing a better world for young people requires us to look at all issues all the time with the child at the center. Voices is the home of the Kids Count Data Center for Virginia that's run through the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So we're able to provide a look at the state and at the local level of a variety, actually hundreds of child well-being indicators, and use that data to scaffold our policy work and our lobbying. And I have this picture here. I want to note that this is our Virginia's Youth in Action Advocacy Cohort for 2023. Virginia's Youth in Action, or VIA, is something we started actually in the fall. It's our we had a pilot program funded by the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation to bring together young advocates from across the state and connect them directly with the legislative process. So the young people you see in this picture have been working with us since October, identifying the issues that are most important in their lives, educating us on those issues, In turn, we are educating them on the political process and on how to build a powerful narrative and share your own story. And this is a photo from our advocacy day in January. These young people had 22 legislative meetings that day, and they held their own press conference that day. And we are so proud of them. And I mean, you can see on their faces what a fabulous day it was. It was great to connect with legislators. So in talking about the General Assembly in 2023, we really need to go back to all the things that happened before the legislature gavelled in January. And I'm talking about the pandemic, and I'm talking about the youth mental health crisis. Going into this session, there was and still is a statewide and national focus on what the heck happened to kids and their mental health over the last 3 years. So in November, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, or JLARC, which is the sort of internal research arm of the General Assembly, and it's actually nonpartisan. JLARC released a report on the impacts of the pandemic on K-12 education. And that report was stunning in its conclusions. So we knew broadly what this report was going to say. The report detailed significant setbacks in student academic outcomes, and we expected that. And we expected significant challenges to youth mental health. And because we know that, I'm a parent, I've seen that. I don't think we were prepared for just how staggering the data would be in this report. So every 2 years, the Virginia Department of Education, in partnership with the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services, issues what they call a school climate survey. And students across the state take this survey, and it provides us a good indicator of how welcoming a school is, what students are experiencing at that school. And this graphic right here is from the JLARC report. This data is from that school climate survey. And I think this is a really staggering chart. And I was shocked when I saw it at the meeting where JLARC presented its information to the legislature back in November. 64% of high school students report feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge over the last few years. 40% of high school students here in the middle reported having felt sad or hopeless for 2 weeks or more, which is an indicator of depression. More than half of high school students reported they were not able to stop or control worrying. And then here on the right side of the chart, we have some more severe indicators of mental health challenges with considering or attempting suicide. And I think what was also really upsetting was the numbers for middle school students. We're talking about children ages, around 11 to 14. Half of middle school students reporting that they feel anxious, nervous, or on edge. This is the youth mental health crisis in Virginia in one chart. I know that many of the folks in this room have been studying this crisis. I know the Community Foundation of Northern Virginia just released a great report on young people, and many organizations are working on this portrait of a thriving youth. And this is something we've all been thinking about. So this is the chart the legislature saw in November. I wanted to also note that school staff reported to JLARC that they are deeply concerned about student mental health. Half of school staff reported that student anxiety or mental health were very serious issues. Youth mental health providers called what we're experiencing a pandemic of anxiety. A pediatrician noted that their practice had become a mental health practice. And we all know, of course, bringing this back to the context of K-12 education, that student mental health issues can negatively affect academic performances. I also want to note another chart the legislature received prior to gaveling in. This is a survey of school staff on their perception of student behavior. And school staff, educators, are rating student behavior as the most serious issue that they are tackling in schools today. And over half of the surveyed staff reported that student behavior was, quote, a very serious problem. And you can see here on these bars that many educators are noting that the number and the severity of behavioral issues in school are greatly increased. I think we knew that would be the case. I think it's important to name what children have experienced over the last 3 years as trauma. At Voices, we are very invested in trauma-informed care and in trauma-informed approaches to education, to the provision of mental health services, and to youth development in general. And unfortunately, we're seeing the outcomes of that. So JLARC's report came out in November, around the same time at the end of 2022. The advocacy organization Mental Health America released its 2023 report ranking states on mental health care access and outcomes. And Virginia was ranked number 48 in the nation for youth mental health. And you've heard this talking point since the fall. Governor Youngkin has mentioned it in announcing some of his budget initiatives, 48th for youth mental health. And that's a ranking of the actual incidence of youth mental health challenges like major depression, as well as the ability of young people to access care in their communities. So not only do we have a pandemic of anxiety or a pandemic of mental health challenges, we have a pandemic of an inability to access services, and the need right now far outpaces the ability of service providers across the state to meet the needs of young people. And it's certainly worse in some areas, in rural areas in Southwest Virginia. Waiting lists are even longer. But right here in Richmond, where I sit, it's hard. It's hard to find mental health care for young people. And then finally, we're in this culture war around parent rights and around the role of parents in determining their child's future, and around the role of schools in supporting children or in driving ideological agendas. This is not work that Voices really takes on, but the culture wars are brewing, and they are certainly a backdrop as we headed into the General Assembly. So I mentioned youth mental health, and I think we all have observed this crisis, and there's a lot of conversation happening right now on how to respond. In December, Governor Youngkin proposed his budget amendments for the coming year, made a lot of announcements that week. And one of his most major announcements was a transformation of Virginia's behavioral health system. It is called the Right Help, Right Now plan. And it's hundreds of millions of dollars in new funding for DBHDS, DMAS, many of the agencies that carry out behavioral health in Virginia. And a strong feature of this plan is actual investments that are directed at children. So a talking point at Voices for years has been that the budget of the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, DBHDS, has only 10% dedicated to meeting the needs of youth. It's a system built for adults, and only 10% of the funding of DBHDS is dedicated to providing children and youth with mental health care. That would change with the budget amendments proposed by Governor Youngkin. So at the top here under crisis care, Governor Youngkin's proposal would fund the construction of new residential crisis stabilization units for kids. These units are CSWs, are crisis receiving units, and they are often an alternative to having to place a child or an adult in a psychiatric hospital. They, the fact is, when someone is going through a crisis, they don't always need to be subject to a TDO or to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital, but they need a higher level of care than just what their community services board or their therapist office could provide. And residential crisis stabilization units can provide that across the state. Right now, there are only 25 RCSW beds dedicated to kids across Virginia. And this funding would, in the administration's best estimate, fund the complete need for beds for children across the state. We also had $15 million in Governor Youngkin's proposal to expand school-based mental health services. There was a pilot program started last year with about, I want to say $8 million or so to provide flexible funding to schools to actually bring in private service providers to help children and youth with their mental health challenges in schools. So Governor Youngkin's budget proposals would expand that. And workforce is always something we're talking about when we talk mental health, and the budget proposal would offer loan repayment options for child and adolescent psychiatric providers. We know there's a provider shortage across all mental health care in Virginia, but it's particularly acute for providers who are trained to work with children, and especially trained to work with children in a trauma-informed way. So that's the backdrop. Let me go back a little bit. That's the backdrop going into the General Assembly session. Children, and particularly youth mental health, was top of mind. So I'm going to talk about some of the legislation that has been passed, that has been passed through both the House and the Senate, is waiting an approval by the governor, and will hopefully become law in July. The truth is, not a lot of bills were passed this year. It was a session with a lot of mixed results for everyone. The partisan divide between the House and the Senate meant that to get a bill through, it had to have broad bipartisan appeal. And of course, we're still waiting on budget outcomes, which I'll talk about at the end of my presentation. But so what legislation was actually passed for kids? I'll get to the mental health stuff toward the end because a lot of that is budget. But I did want to bring attention to a few major areas for child well-being. One of them is early care and education. If you have young children or young grandchildren or neighbors with young children, you've probably heard about how unaffordable and inaccessible our early care and education system is, how desperate many providers are for support. And a lot of folks really across the state, the Thrive Birth to 5 network, and many advocates are doing fantastic work on scaffolding out that system and building something that's actually affordable and accessible. Well, this year, the legislature passed a bill that actually creates a commission on early childhood care and education. This had previously existed as what was called the School Readiness Committee in the General Assembly. It is now a full commission with greatly expanded scope. The legislation requires them to add 18 citizen members, and those members need to represent a variety of geographies and interests from across the state. And the bill also gives them a mandate to look at workforce issues as well. So we're hoping that all of the momentum around early care and education will influence this commission, and that this will be a body that is able to have the credibility and the gravitas to really recommend some more bold transformation. Budget TBD on early care and education. We are waiting to hear about some more investments in mixed delivery preschool grants in Petersburg and Hopewell, and also in Southwest Virginia. We'll see about that. Family economic security is another major issue for voices and for many child advocates in our space. Not a lot of progress on what I would call bold, visionary, or transformational laws on family economic security. Delegate Tran, Senator McClellan, now Congresswoman McClellan, introduced a bill that would create a child tax credit at the state level in Virginia. Many of us are familiar with how transformational the refundable child tax credit at the federal level was during the height of the pandemic, and how it actually cut poverty. It actually cut child poverty We had an effort this session to recreate that at the state level. That was defeated. There was also an effort to expand the earned income tax credit in Virginia, and actually to provide more benefits. That also failed. Possibly it's at stake as leverage in the budget negotiations, but we'll see about that. There was also a bill to create a paid family leave program in Virginia that would be administered by the Virginia Employment Commission. That's been brewing in the Senate for many years. This year it did actually pass the Senate, but it failed in the House. And this is the course of a lot of big legislation in Virginia. There's incremental change. You get a little further each year and you come back the following year and try again. We're still waiting on the budget to tell us what will happen with taxes in Virginia. And really the tax question is what is holding up the budget process. There are some tax relief for families at play. There could be an increase to the standard deduction. We don't know. Briefly on child health care access, there were, Delegate Rasool sponsored a bill to create a perinatal health hub at the Virginia Department of Health that passed. Cover All Kids is an effort to expand health coverage to all children, regardless of immigration status, and that failed this year. Food access is another one of Voice's big issues because it is a social determinant of health. And we had some incremental progress on food access this year. Efforts by Representative Rome to expand sort of access and connection to parents to get them signed up for free school meals and to get them signed up for SNAP and using the school as a vehicle to do that. The Universal School Meals bill sponsored by Delegate Mike Mullen did fail, and I suspect that someone else will try to carry the torch on that. Last year, we saw during the pandemic, as universal school meal eligibility was expanded by USDA, we had a lot fewer kids hungry, and we'd like to be able to do that at the state level as well. So mental health, the big issue for young people during session, and really I want to share also mental health and mental health care access are the biggest topic of conversation among the youth advocates we work with. So there was an effort to create an advisory committee for the Behavioral Health Commission, or otherwise known as the Deeds Commission, led by Senator Creigh Deeds. That has passed, and that advisory committee will have to include folks in the field with lived experience in the behavioral health system. A bill we opposed would have actually removed medical autonomy from older young people, like 14 and up, who are seeking mental health treatment. The law actually stipulates that those young people should be considered adults for purposes of controlling their own mental health care. This bill was a parents' rights bill that would have put that power back in the parents' hands, and it was defeated. And we're still waiting to hear about mental health investments in the budget. We do think we have a great shot at more mental health investments because it's been a bipartisan issue. There's been bipartisan support. I suspect that more money for community services boards to meet the needs of young people will be in the budget, but they've got to work out their tax deal first. Mental health in schools. So there were a series of comprehensive school mental health reforms proposed. Those all passed. So schools are going to be able to access more funding to bring in appropriate personnel to meet mental health needs of students. There is money in the budget, again, TBD, but we are very hopeful because it has bipartisan support to increase personnel funding so that schools can make good hires. Child welfare, not a lot going on in child welfare during this session. There were some big efforts that sort of fizzled out. There was an interesting bill passed that will create a study of legal representation for parents who are involved in the child welfare system. Unlike the criminal system, when a parent has been accused of abuse or neglect and the custody of their children is in question, they're not guaranteed a court-appointed attorney until very, very late in the process, and actually too late in the process for them to have meaningful legal representation, at least from my perspective as a former legal aid attorney. And so the General Assembly is going to study that issue. There was also a bill that was defeated, this SB 1214 from Senator Lucas, would have removed the presumption of abuse or neglect against a parent for marijuana use or possession. That was an attempt to sort of make our child welfare laws comport with our new marijuana laws. Essentially, if marijuana is no longer going to be a serious offense, then it shouldn't be used as evidence of abuse or neglect in a child custody proceeding. That was defeated. I suspect advocates will be back in the future to get that done. And student belonging, I wanted to highlight this bill, SB 1300. It was championed by Senator Cree Deeds, and it was actually developed and designed by youth advocate Elijah Lee, who lives here in Richmond, attends Maggie Walker. This is Elijah in the picture, and Elijah works with Voices. And this bill would require trauma-informed care training for teachers. And this was something Elijah actually brought to Voices, and we were able to help shepherd along through the process. You know, in the category of K-12 education and student belonging, a lot of bills were defeated. And that's because these were a lot of these culture war bills that were very ideological and that just weren't going to have a chance in a divided legislature. So they had their hearings, you know, their advocates had their day, but they just didn't have the bipartisan support to get through. One of those was this uniform school discipline bill, and really it came from both parties, the sort of more ideological bills as they carried out the K-12 culture wars. Those really didn't advance. So let's talk budget, and then I'll pass it over to Brian. The budget is to be decided. There's a lot at stake for public education in the budget, actually hundreds of millions of dollars. Most of it aimed at just increasing the number of qualified educators in schools. I think we're all aware of the teacher shortage. And in addition to a general teacher shortage, there's a shortage of what we call support staff, folks like counselors and instructional aides, folks like school psychologists and social workers. These folks are instrumental in meeting mental health needs in school, and they're instrumental in making schools run well, and we need more of them. So there are many proposals on the table, as I said, hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, but the budget is still TBD. What we do have right now is what's being called a skinny budget. And it's being called a skinny budget because there's not much in it. I mean, it's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of different priority areas. So the skinny budget was really passed as a stopgap measure to correct this mistake that was made by the Department of Education in a spreadsheet somewhere when they were calculating state aid to public schools. They made an error. They forgot to account for the expiration of a sales tax in Virginia. And schools were led to believe, based on those calculations, that they were getting a lot more state aid than the state thought they were getting. And schools relied on that when they did their budgets, and it would have created a shortfall of over $200 million for local school districts. So the General Assembly has corrected that mistake in the skinny budget. They've appropriated enough money to cover the mistake and to hold schools harmless. They've also made a deposit into the rainy day fund, which is a constitutional obligation. And they put a little bit into VRS and authorized a little bit of money to cover some capital projects that had already been approved. But that's the skinny budget. It's not a lot. There's not a lot in it. It just, it helps the schools along, and the rest of us wait. So what do I think we might see in the forthcoming budget? I do think we will make progress on youth mental health, because legislators on both sides of the aisle have indicated that they know it's important and that we've got to make some transformational change. So I think we'll get a lot more money. I think most of the Youngkin proposal will go forward. And I think then the question for us advocates and for funders across the state is, wow, there's all this money in the budget. What are we doing to help implementation along? How is this money actually being deployed in communities to meet our needs? I do think we'll see an increase in the Medicaid reimbursement rate for children's behavioral health services. This was a piece of legislation that was actually championed by one of our partners, Child Savers, here in Richmond, who said, hey, we've got to increase Medicaid reimbursement rates to allow folks like us to continue doing good work and hire enough professionals to meet the needs of the community. And I do think that the $15 million proposed to expand that school-based mental health pilot program will be in the budget. These are, I think, safe bets because they have bipartisan support. Disclaimer that I do not have a crystal ball, but I do think we'll see some good progress in these areas when the budget comes out. So I want to conclude with just some General Assembly trends, and a few of us were talking about this before the meeting. So this is a graphic from VPAP. I love the information and services provided by VPAP. So a little less than 40% of introduced legislation passed in the General Assembly this year. The divided House and Senate really cancel each other out. So anything too extreme, and I mean that just in, it's sort of outside of the window of general public support for public policy. Anything outside of that window is going to be killed when it crosses over to the other side. So that's one reason I think we saw fewer pieces of legislation making it through this year. This is the second year in a row that the budget has not been completed on time. I think you've probably seen in the news, many legislators have remarked that perhaps 45 days or 60 days is just not enough time to do the work of a state budget. Few bills this session really included significant or sweeping policy changes. And even when those bills were proposed, they probably were amended and became a study or new guidance for a state agency this year, which we found interesting. And then, as several of us were remarking on prior to this presentation, this massive exodus of legislators from the General Assembly will lead to significant knowledge gaps next year. We are losing, I think, collectively hundreds of years of legislative experience. From my point of view, some of our longstanding child welfare, child advocacy champions are leaving. There are folks who have just tremendous knowledge in the state budget process who are leaving. And it will mean that the legislature is, I think it will be a little clunkier next year as folks start to understand the lawmaking process and start to get up to speed on the issues that are most important to Virginians. I also think it's a fantastic opportunity for folks to do education of candidates and of new elected officials once they're in office on the issues. I think from my point of view, a lot of folks want to be a child advocate and they say they're a champion for kids. So I'm trying to look at this as an opportunity for us to really educate people and start to develop the next Jennifer McClellan or the next big champion for young people. I'll also just say Voices has been doing youth mental health policy work for several years. We are planning a summit to talk about many of the issues I highlighted earlier in this presentation. It'll take place October 11th, and we look forward to seeing people there. And I'm not sure if there are questions.
We're gonna
Yep.
hold questions until after we hear from Brian. So thank you for that, Rachel. It's very, very informative, and I think it's very helpful to see the different buckets and where there was some progress made, although limited, and to see where there might be some bright spots that still remain to be determined in the budget negotiations. So we are going to kind of add to our knowledge by hearing from Brian. And Brian, looking forward to hearing from your perspective on the housing front and what was accomplished or hasn't yet been accomplished in Richmond.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and allowing me to spend some time with you all.
Terrific.
We go.
Please, your
So
slides now.
yeah, so like Rachel said, she and I used to work together many, many years ago. So honor and a pleasure to be able to share some space with her again in new roles for both of us. And so, yeah, I'm Brian Koziel, Executive Director of the Virginia Housing Alliance, and we basically represent the nonprofit affordable housing community, everybody from tax credit developers and investors to homeless service providers and everything in between, right? And so we have statewide reach and work with our partner agencies and to advance affordable housing and related services across the Commonwealth. There's that. And so we do this work through advocacy, education, and capacity building. And just really quickly, we host 3 annual events that are targeted to kind of professional development for different sectors of our industry, as well as ongoing education for service providers to better help them serve their clients. And then operate a AmeriCorps Vista program. Currently, our upcoming cohort will have 18 AmeriCorps Vistas at housing nonprofits across the Commonwealth, and those are really to help them build their capacity. Super proud of that program because at the last analysis we did, half of them get hired on at their host site. A quarter of them get hired on at another affordable housing agency across the Commonwealth, and then a quarter of them go on to pursue, other things. But really focused on building the capacity of our industry so that we know that the need is growing, and we need to be able to respond to that in kind of a comprehensive manner. So to kind of piggyback off of what Rachel was talking about, I think that if I just had talked about housing successes this year at the General Assembly, it would be a 30-second to maybe I could maybe stretched out to 2 or 3 minute conversation. It was long and short of it, it was for many reasons. I think Rachel touched upon all of them. Just a very, very difficult session. A lot of things went to study. And again, we do what we do best is just kind of kick the can down the road when it comes to housing. And so I did want to just do a really quick rental market overview and kind of say, hey, this is the lay of the land. This is what the crisis that we're looking at looks like. And then talk about state and federal funding sources. A lot of folks have been coming to me of like, hey, how does all of this stuff work? And it's housing, much like other sectors, is largely funded at the federal level, and then we get some state dollars, and a lot of it is enacted at the local level. All of it is enacted at the local level, so it gets complicated quick. And then wrap up with a legislative overview. And so what we're looking at, these 2 top charts, I know Governor Youngkin keeps talking about how we are losing population. And what is actually happening is we are our rate of population growth is slowing, right? So the rate of change is decreasing, but our population is continuing to rise, which places pressure on our housing inventory. This chart from my colleagues at Housing Forward Virginia, who are looking at types of housing over time by the annual building permits by structure type. Largely in Virginia, we build that dark blue single family. This is true across the nation as well. But what we're really interested in is that purple and light blue, large multifamily 5+ units or small multifamily units. And the big thing to note here is the economic downturn of tail end of 07, 08, and 09. We have yet to recover from that. And so we really need to be producing housing units in this range, 50 to 60,000 per unit per year. We are just coming up half of that in Virginia after, this huge decline. So we're not even back up to parity. This is just a look at the national level of housing completions per year. And we see this same precipitous drop off, but what we don't see in Virginia is this rebound, right? We just stay flat. Whereas the rest of the nation has cumulatively started to gain ground post recession. So it is largely a supply side issue, but it is also about demand and about rental protections in housing. And so I kind of view, the solution to our affordable housing crisis as this three-legged stool: supply, demand, and increasing tenant protections. So basically, setting the stage: low supply, growing demand. What do we see? Percent change in median rent from first quarter of 2011 to last quarter of 2022. On average in Virginia, we see 44%, right? I know for a fact paychecks did not increase 44% over that time period. And so we're seeing a lot more people having to spend a lot more on housing, and this is true everywhere in Virginia. This is just another data visualization, a couple different indices measuring year-over-year change in median rent. I think the most accurate and certainly the newest indices are from the National Apartment List and the Zillow Observed Rent Indices. And those are the ones that peaked in January 2022. And we are starting to see some contraction in rents being asked, but it's not an equal contraction across Virginia and certainly not across the nation. They're still really strong markets, but some markets are starting to weaken. So we hopefully will see some downward pressure on rent. What does all of that mean in Virginia? We've got an identified shortage of about 300,000 affordable homes, right? And in housing, we talk a lot about area median income and how that relates to one's ability to pay rent. Standard budgetary practicing kind of dictates that you don't spend more than 30% of your household income on rent or a mortgage. But, and so the lower income you are, the more difficult it is to find housing, and the greater the shortage in that area. It just becomes increasingly more difficult to build deeply affordable housing for a variety of reasons. But here's the gap. Housing cost burden. So these are households that are spending more than 30% of their income by income groups. So extremely low income, you're looking at costs, about 85 to 90% of all households that are extremely low income are cost burden. Severely cost burden is 50%, spending 50% or more of your household income on rent, right? So almost 3 out of 4 households are spending more than 50% of their income on rent. And as income increases, cost burden goes down. This is looking at the affordable and available homes per 100 renter households at those same income brackets. Again, really easy to build. We do a much better job at building new or renovating old housing into affordable housing at the 100% area median income, even down to 80% area median income. We are able to layer a lot of different resources to build those units. It just gets more and more difficult and resource intensive at about 50% or less of area median income. So what does all of this mean? It means that people that are the absolute essential workers, the backbone of our economy, are unable to afford rent in any market in the Commonwealth. Bartenders, hairstylists, bus drivers, automotive service techs. You know, we like to talk about workforce housing. I actually don't like to talk about workforce housing, but others like to talk about workforce housing as if it is a special subset of workers that should be, you know, have this special preference for housing, teachers and nurses and first responders. And, you know, I'm of the opinion that everybody deserves housing, right? But we don't talk about, you know, janitorial workers, fast food workers, home health workers, right? Folks that are working full time that are making, you know, extremely low incomes and unable to work in their communities or struggling mightily to reside in their communities in close proximity to their jobs. So this is just the annual income over here, $40,000 to afford a studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, all the way up to 4 bedroom. You know, very few folks can even afford a studio apartment, much less for a larger family. In Richmond, same exact thing. In Kingsport and Bristol rental market, same exact thing, probably even more pronounced in Virginia Beach, Newport News rental market, Harrisonburg. We're seeing the same, regardless of geographic location. It is the same issue across the state. So really quickly, I'm going to jump into funding sources. And this comes out of a JLARC report that they put together in a report that came out December of 2021 called Affordable Housing in Virginia, in which they, you know, JLARC identified that shortage of 300,000 units. They put a price tag on it of $5 billion annually to address. And so where are we in terms of funding and where does that come from? So the largest, you know, 89% of housing resources come from the federal government. And 3/4 of that, well, half of that is for rental subsidies in the form of housing choice vouchers and project-based rental assistance. And that is 32% and 19.8% here. You know, 29% goes to low-income housing tax credit program to build affordable housing. But really, the tax credit program will get us down to about 60% of area median income, maybe a little bit more, but it's not really effective at building deeply affordable housing, which is where the National Housing Trust Fund comes in, some home dollars, and some other smaller funding sources. But, you know, Virginia receives about $1.5 billion, half of which comes through rental subsidies. The other half kind of goes straight to local governments through CDBG funding or ESG grants. So in Virginia, we're looking at about 11% of the funding, total funding for housing, half of which is provided by our housing finance agency, Virginia Housing, and through a profit sharing agreement that they have. And, very little of it comes from the General Assembly, right? So about 40% of it comes from the Virginia Housing Trust Fund, and then a smaller amount in various programs administered by the Department of Housing and Community Development. Virginia Housing Trust Fund is by far our largest tool for the development of deeply affordable housing. And so you can see how it has grown over time. It was created in FY13, I believe, but not funded until FY14. We have been largely successful in growing the fund significantly, but even at its current level of $75 million per year, we're looking at it will fund $75 million a year. Sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But when we're looking at the investment in housing, the impact that it makes, we're going to build about maybe 6,500 units of affordable housing off of that $75 million. The trust fund accounts for about $12,000 per unit, but for a 30-year affordability period, right? And so if you look at it on an annualized basis, it's really kind of one of the better investments that I believe that the Commonwealth could make. But the other thing is we layer Housing Trust Fund with some of those federal programs, Home Dollars, National Housing Trust Fund, and then the HIE program, Housing Innovations and Energy Efficiency, which comes from the sale of carbon credits through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which the administration is continuing to explore ways to undercut and remove us from, but has become a very important funding tool for affordable housing. So what were our legislative priorities this year, and how did we do? So we are, going back to that kind of three-legged stool: supply, demand, and tenant rights, tenant protections. That's kind of how we build our legislative agenda every year, is make sure that we are focused on strategically impacting all three of those areas. And so we, in partnership with some of our partners, we're pushing for the Virginia Housing Stability Fund to basically provide rental assistance to our most vulnerable neighbors across the Commonwealth. Initially, our initial ask was about 8 times what you see here on this slide of $90 million to fund a 3-year pilot rental assistance program. Even at $700 million, we were looking at only addressing 5% of that rental need, right? And so rental subsidy is hugely expensive, hugely impactful. But what Virginia does not do very well, with the exception of education, is kind of entitlement programs, ongoing funding. And so we will be back next year to work on this again. We will always work to increase the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. We were unsuccessful with getting budget amendments included to add $75 million to the current amount, which would bring it up to $150 million per year. Folks ask me all the time, like, what is the dollar amount? Like, what do you need in the Housing Trust Fund? Long story short, it's way more than what we've got, right? And I'm backing up. The other 20% of it goes to homeless reduction grants. And so as we increase the Housing Trust Fund, we're also increasing resources to prevent and end homelessness in communities across the Commonwealth, which particularly now with rents, having skyrocketed and hopefully plateauing and coming down in some cases, and evictions ramping back up. Housing instability and homelessness are certainly on the rise. So our third priority was to have the Department of Housing and Community Development to conduct a housing needs assessment every 5 years and a housing plan every 2 years to coincide with the biennial budget. Blows my mind that there is no state plan for housing that kind of any new administration can pick up and read and say, hey, this looks like a good direction. This is what the partners and the agencies have really worked on, and this is where we need to go. It's all kind of piecemeal at the current moment. We are also working on permitting accessory dwelling units by right. This was what we thought was going to be a more successful bill this year. It is a property rights bill, just allowing folks to build accessory dwelling units on their property in all single family zone districts across the Commonwealth. Defeated. We'll be back next year on that. And then supporting a budget amendment to provide a very small amount of money for Department of Medical Assistance Services, DMAS, to conduct a rate study for the future implementation of the high need support Medicaid benefit. And what this Medicaid benefit would do is allow providers of housing assistant services and employment services to be compensated for their work. And it really is a critical component to providing housing and employment services for Medicaid qualified individuals, particularly in high need support. Is open to folks with complex medical and behavioral health issues, those experiencing or at risk of being homeless, and certainly those that are currently unhoused. And so it would provide supportive services. It will not provide rent, but it will provide supportive services for folks to gain access to housing and retain that housing. Just a quick overview of the Senate budget and the House budget. The Senate budget did include $50 million for permanent supportive housing, which is a intervention that combines long-term rental assistance with supportive services for our current populations are folks with serious mental illness, parents, pregnanting or parent women with substance abuse disorder, developmental disabilities, and then chronic homelessness. And so really effective way to provide housing long-term and the wraparound supportive services to help folks keep that housing, but also to hopefully ease crisis that they're experiencing from being unhoused. There was $3 million in the for manufactured home parks affordable housing pilot. About $350,000 for a residential site and structures locator program, really kind of piggybacking on this mapping tool that the Virginia Economic Development Partnership Program uses for sites, right? They've got a whole site selection website where you can go on and be like, hey, I'm looking for a manufacturing site in Wythe County. You go on there and see what's available. But this is sort of the same thing for residential site and structures. I don't think it'll necessarily have a huge impact on affordability, but it was included in the Senate budget. Fortunately, we did get money in both budgets for the statewide housing needs assessment. And then the Senate was so kind to create a list of contingent funding priorities and include the Housing Trust Fund based upon if there are available resources at the end of the fiscal year. House budget was really tight, only got some additional support for the housing division at DHCD. And so legislative outcomes, for a variety of reasons, Rachel really did hit the nail on the head. Like, not a lot of bills got passed this year. A lot of things got punted. Certainly nothing contentious. Certainly nothing forward thinking or progressive or anything in my opinion that really is going to be hugely impactful or transformative. We didn't even come close to that this year. The most transformative, and I think I've got ahead of myself during testimony on this bill. I said perhaps the most impactful. Actually, probably didn't get ahead of myself because this actually a housing needs assessment being the most impactful housing bill of the year, I think sums up how the legislative session went this year. But really, this is going to hopefully make a difference and have the state assess the need and start putting plans into place to coordinate all of these funding resources that are and state agencies that to really move us forward, hopefully in coming years. There were some other landlord tenant bills, that will certainly help some folks, but not massive impact across the board. HB 1702 requires landlords to provide a separate written notice of any increase in rent. Delegate Prices 2441 require landlords who are terminating month-to-month leases for at least half of their units or 20 units to provide a 60-day notice. And this kind of is a workaround to combat some private equity investments that we're seeing across the Commonwealth. And then Senate Bill 1089 and House Bill 1836 requires sheriffs to actually report back to the court when they execute a writ of eviction. So hopefully a data collection tool that will help us get a little bit more accurate and clear picture around eviction data. And then Delegate Bulova, House Bill 1635, just kind of clarifies the process to get money back into the hands of an applicant for someone who signs a lease, but then shows up and the unit is uninhabitable. And basically what this combats is really somebody coming in from out of state, seeing a unit online and saying, hey, that looks good. And then they sign a lease and then they show up to move in, and those pictures weren't the same as the unit that they're moving into. So there are certainly a lot of areas where we will be working, hopefully with the administration. I will say, we're not out of favor. And I know the governor has been on record talking about affordable housing, but I do think, and he even came up with Make Virginia Home housing plan, but he has clearly said no new subsidies, right? He said basically of the opinion that we have tried the subsidy route for years and years and years, which really just is not the case. We've only really been trying since 21 in the middle of a global health pandemic, and some of this money went to rental assistance and not production. And we're really only at a fraction of what we need here in the Housing Trust Fund. So we haven't tried the subsidy program, or we haven't tried the subsidy route, not in any sincere earnest. And so he's looking at other opportunities to deregulate and speed along the development timeline. It does take a long time to build housing, needlessly so. And part of that is leaning on local governments to do a better job. But certainly going back to that kind of housing needs gap that we have, you cannot build housing that meets the needs of extremely low income housing or low income residents without deep subsidy. And so we will always be in the fight for increasing the amount of subsidies in Virginia, as well as expanding access to permanent supportive housing, reducing evictions and ending homelessness. So
Yes, thank you, Brian. We do have a few questions, and I'm just thinking in light of time, because we do want to wrap up around 3:30, we are not going to break into small groups, but instead just stay with the full group for discussion.